The world is a crazy place right now, and there is a lot of uncertainty about where things are headed. Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine has already cost countless innocent lives and is destroying property and infrastructure on a level that hasn't been seen in 80 years. Apart from the humanitarian disaster, it's also causing economic challenges, certainly for Ukraine, but also for Europe at large and the rest of the world as well. In this video, I want to talk about some of those economic challenges and specifically talk about what effect the war in Ukraine will have on the price of lumber and other commodities. The answer is not always that things are just going to go up. It's a little bit more complicated than that, so stick around and I'll explain. Ukraine itself doesn't have much of a forest industry, and its economy consists mainly of commodities like iron and steel, machinery manufacturing, and agriculture. Most of its output is sold to Russia and the other former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. Russia, on the other hand, has vast forests. In fact, nearly 50% of the entire country is covered in forests, and Russia has nearly as much forested land as Brazil and Canada combined. That said, the forestry industry in Russia is not as developed as it is in North America, or the rest of Europe for that matter. And even though it has vast amounts of standing timber, Russia is only responsible for about 9% of the total forest products in the world. And most of what Russia exports are raw logs, which are then processed in other countries like Finland. For the past few years, Russia has been trying to change that and better develop its forest industry. In fact, in 2020, Russia announced that they would significantly limit the export of valuable hardwoods out of the country in an effort to build up their domestic forest industry. The change went into full effect at the start of 2022, just before the invasion. Now, with Russia and Ukraine being at war, human rights groups have called for a boycott of Russian timber and wood products, and Western forestry and equipment businesses have halted investments and stopped shipments of forestry parts and equipment to Russia. With that in mind, Russia is unlikely to be able to stand up their domestic timber business anytime soon. So what kind of impact will this have on the lumber market as a whole? Well, this is where it gets interesting, and that's because China is the largest consumer of Russian lumber, but China also gets a lot of lumber from other places like Canada. The US used to export a lot of lumber to China, but since the trade war that took place under the Trump administration, US exports of lumber to China have been cut considerably.
China, I love them, China.
So what could happen is that China may end up buying even more Russian lumber at probably favorable prices, more favorable than they can get from Canadians in other countries. This would lead to less demand for Canadian lumber and potentially lower prices in closer markets like the US. Europe is a little different story, and that's because a lot of lumber from Russia ends up in Europe. Lumber exports from Russia to the rest of Europe have already been cut, but that was announced years ago, and so European countries have had a little bit of time to prepare. Even still, that is bad news for Europe, as countries with more significant forest industries like Norway, Sweden, and Finland will not likely be able to fill the void that Russia is leaving behind. In Europe, lumber products will likely be much more expensive than they have been. So in the US and Canada, the general effect is probably even, with lumber maybe even being cheaper in the US. And that's because you have lumber demand decreasing in one market and increasing in another. In China, lumber will probably be much cheaper, as they are still Russia's biggest customers and will likely be able to buy a ton of lumber at a discount, as other customers for Russian lumber are drying up. So that is what I think is going to happen to lumber in general. But let's take it one step further and really understand what it is that the US is importing from Russia. Now, here is a chart of Russian forest product imports to the US for the past few years. As you can see, the value has increased over time and even doubled in 2021 to over $450 million worth of imports. And here is a chart showing what Russia actually imported to the US. The biggest import to the US is hardwood plywood. Now, this hardwood plywood goes by a very specific name, and that is Baltic birch. Sometimes it's differentiated between Russian birch and Baltic birch. Now, if you're not familiar, Baltic birch is a very high quality hardwood plywood that's used in the US to build cabinets and furniture. Now, Baltic birch is also made in other countries like Finland, for example, but a lot of the logs that are processed into Baltic birch plywood in Finland originate in Russia. So while the war in Ukraine will have a moderate impact to the price of lumber in general, there will be a significant impact to the cost of Baltic birch plywood. This means that cabinets in general and furniture that uses Baltic birch plywood will be more expensive. Now, lastly, when the war is finally over, there will be a huge demand for building supplies in Ukraine. No one knows when that will be and what exactly will be needed, but when the time comes, that will certainly have an unprecedented impact on building supplies in general, including and maybe especially lumber. There are other commodities that are going to increase in price as well. I don't think that I need to say much about oil, so I won't. But Russia is also a huge producer of metals like nickel, for example. Nickel is used in batteries, especially in batteries for electric vehicles, as well as a lot of other things like stainless steel. This means that your Teslas and your stainless steel appliances will all become more expensive. Probably though, the biggest impact and most concerning of all is food. Ukraine has been called the breadbasket of Europe. They grow a lot of wheat and other agricultural products. While Ukraine's president has encouraged Ukrainian farmers to plant, with all the turmoil and displacement, there will definitely be a sharp reduction in output. Russia also produces a lot of food, and those exports are up in the air as well. Now, this is one of those slow-moving disasters. We likely won't feel the effect of it for many months, and while developed countries will be hit with higher food prices, they will likely get by just fine. It's in poorer and less developed countries, however, that the war and its effects have the potential to create real problems like widespread famine. No one wins in war, and this war is terrible. I pray for the Ukrainian people, and I pray that the war will end soon so that people can mourn their dead and begin rebuilding their lives. If you want to help the people of Ukraine, I've included a list of reputable organizations to donate to in the description. So take a look at that. If you found this video interesting, please be sure to like it and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini!